Hi, thanks for joining us. My name is Colin Dueck, a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. This is our panel on the future of conservative foreign policy, part of a series we're doing on this subject. The past few years have raised first-order questions about what it means to be a conservative on American foreign policy issues. There's obviously more than one point of view on that, and American conservatives are discussing and debating basic assumptions on foreign policy, not only with liberals and progressives, but with one another. AEI's position is clear in favor of American leadership, also in favor of open and civil exchange of ideas on these issues. It's in that spirit that I'm very happy to welcome today's panelists. Nadia Schadlow is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. She was the leading author of the 2017 U.S. National Security Strategy and Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy in 2018 for the Trump administration. She previously was Senior Program Officer in the International Security and Foreign Policy Program of the Smith-Richardson Foundation. Kelley Vlahos is Senior Advisor to the Quincy Institute and Contributing Editor at the American Conservative. Kori is Director of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. She's held a number of leading positions at the U.S. Department of Defense, Department of State, and the National Security Council. She's a contributing writer at The Atlantic and War on the Rocks, and is the author of Safe Passage, a book about the rise of America to world power. I've asked all three panelists to make an opening statement on the following questions. What do you see as the current state of play among conservatives within the United States on foreign policy issues? What do you think a conservative foreign policy might look like in the coming years given existing trends? What do you think a conservative foreign policy should look like? And what makes it specifically conservative? So for the audience, please send questions. After the panelists have made their opening statements, I'll ask them a number of related questions, including those from our online audience. And the order in each round will be Nadia, Kelley, and Kori. So the premise of this panel is that a lively, civil, good faith exchange between different types of conservatives is possible on foreign policy issue. Welcome, and Nadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Colin, and it's great to be here with Colin, Kelley, and Kori. I feel like I ruined the alliteration with my name, but nonetheless, it's great to be here today. So I'll begin with a few remarks. I will follow Colin's script and make a few remarks, and then I look forward to the discussion. So I think today, as Colin mentioned, why are we here? We're here because there are tensions, disagreements, or certainly debate across maybe three schools of thought on the Republican side, on the center-right side, on the conservative side of things. We might call the first conservative internationalism, internationalists who want to stay actively involved in the world. Two, we might call the second group retrenchers, people who want to pull back, operate primarily from the United States as the homeland. Some might characterize this group as more isolationist than others. And third, I might say realists, who are probably perhaps between the two, deter adversaries, but understanding that America really has limited agency for many reasons. Those are imperfect categories. I know if we spend time on the categories, we won't actually get to the substance. So I think we should also not do that. And I don't think we should dwell on those. So what I'll do instead is offer a sense of what I think we need to do as conservatives to conserve American freedom. That to me is what is at the core of the matter in the discussion we're having. So I think there are about 6 elements in conserving American freedom and thinking about how to do that. First, we need to acknowledge that power matters, and specifically great power competition matters. Why? Because great powers set the rules of the road, and we can either shape those rules as America, lead in shaping those rules, or be a follower and be disadvantaged. Thus, I think it's dangerous and short-sighted to argue that it was former President Trump's policies or current President Biden's policies that are driving the tensions with China. Any reading of China today, the CCP's own words are that President Xi has made it clear that his goal is to ensure the triumph of his system over ours. As Peter Thiel recently pointed out, Parity means the United States is already losing, and I think we should really think about that. Second, peace depends upon regional balances of power to ensure that one region is not dominated by another. And this is where allies come in. And I know among our debates, there's a lot of discussion of allies. Regional balances of power cannot just depend on the United States alone. Security is not a spectator sport. Allies must contribute more, and many of them are contributing more, but they must do more. And exploring that is an important part of our discussion. Third, related to this, deterrence is critical. As John Norton Moore pointed out in a book that I highly recommend, it's maybe not as well known, called Solving the War Puzzle, he pointed out that wars occur when there is a deadly synergy, he called it, between an aggressive, non-democratic power and the absence of effective deterrence. You need deterrence to prevent wars. Deterrence requires capability and the will to use those capabilities, which means, yes, a strong military, and yes, an increased defense budget. We can talk about that. Fourth, in terms of trade, and this is another lively topic, I know, reciprocity is here to stay. Free trade is based on reciprocity and on all playing by the same rules. Fifth, we need to avoid, Colin, what you have talked about in a recent article, which I thought was great, a submergence in internationality, which means that we get mired in process over outcomes. And this is advancing a process through multilateral institutions that are really difficult to work with sometimes and have difficulty actually achieving the outcomes we want. That doesn't mean that there's not a role for them, but understanding their limitations and adapting to those limitations is really important. And last but not least, we need to think through about what the impact of technology in a serious way. The post-World War II approaches and frameworks we have are simply not up to speed. They can't adapt as quickly as technology demands. And I think the big question for all of us is, can and how can democracies survive the digital technologies that are around us? Can they do that? And if so, how? And I think the current infrastructure is pretty problematic for doing that. Very complicated question. So what all makes this specifically conservative? I thought about your point as well, Colin. I'd say, you know, I'll throw out a few words and then open it up to my colleagues. One, freedom, right? The importance of freedom and ensuring that free and open societies prevail. Two, the importance of power in that equation and acknowledging it. Three, the focus on outcomes, as I mentioned. And fourth, also a focus on opportunities, right? How to exploit those opportunities, how to grow those opportunities, how to take advantage of them. And that leads to questions about our capabilities, our institutional capabilities to do that. So I'll leave it at that. I'm not sure if it was a full 5 minutes, but I'd love to hear from Kelley and Kori and then have the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Nadia. Kelley.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and AEI for having me, and Colin for having me, and just very proud to be here. I know that I'm the outlier on this panel, so I'm going to try to posit some ideas that may seem counterintuitive to the conservative position on foreign policy, but actually when taken into the context of our past and present moment, they're a little bit more natural than you might think. I began writing for the American Conservative, as you mentioned, Colin, in 2007, out of frustration with the post 9/11 wars and what it was doing to our civil liberties at home. Billions of dollars were being poured into the global war on terror, metastasizing the federal bureaucracy and executive powers while clearly fueling terrorism and expanding the military footprint into 2 major theaters abroad. Worse, we were clearly not winning. Something was wrong, and the magazine, which was founded 5 years before in opposition to the Iraq War, was all but vindicated at that point in its dire predictions. But if the magazine was conservative, why weren't they on the bandwagon with the National Review and the Weekly Standard and standard bearers like Fox News? The Republican establishment at the time would have us believe that they were the only conservatism there was. They called the American conservative unpatriotic for suggesting that plunging into preventative wars of choice, into crusades to bring democracy to people who didn't ask for it, wasn't conservative or even American. But the magazine represented a slice, albeit a slim one, of conservatism at the time. Co-founder Pat Buchanan was a paleocon, a traditional nationalist conservative who opposed the global trade system that ripped the working class in America apart. He believed the post 9/11 wars only served Washington's political elite by broadening the targets in an imperial enterprise called the War Against Islamic Extremism. He said this was empire, not republic, and it was using the old Cold War playbook, relying on big government, military primacy, a Manichaean cause, and media propaganda to convince Americans that this was our duty as stewards of the international order to support it. The magazine brought together foreign policy realists who needed only to look at history to see where this so-called global war on terror would go wrong. It drew in civil libertarians, constitutional conservatives who believed that the wars were illegal, that the separation of powers in Washington were dissolving, and the national security state was a threat to regular Americans. Suddenly, government had all sorts of new powers and justifications to spy on Americans, raid their homes, x-ray them at airports, treat them like would-be enemies of the state. None of these powers ever went away, by the way. Meanwhile, the wars have continued. We are just now getting out of Afghanistan after 20 years, but we still have troops in Iraq and in more than 150 countries across the globe. Mostly while we were conducting the early 9/11 wars against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, the US had helped create new and worse terror groups like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and the Islamic State. They keep us entrenched, and the so-called conservative Republicans, always unreflective, use this as a justification for more interventions and bigger Pentagon budgets. The American conservatism that came up through the 1950s, the conservatism represented by Bill Buckley's National Review, railed against centralized power in the form of big government, which was easily corrupted and became disconnected from the interests and values of the people. Unfortunately, they did not see the post-World War II consensus that put America in charge of the international rules-based order or the war on communism in the same frame. But there were always conservatives who thought otherwise, at the risk, of course, of being called isolationists, American firsters, even anti-Semitic and xenophobic. Of course, I believe all that to be disingenuous. Traditional conservatives hewing to the 20th century writings of Russell Kirk, if not the foundations laid by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, and much later, President Eisenhower, believed that restraint in war and global intervention is conservative. They knew that foreign entanglements that do not serve US security interests and imposing our liberal vision on others would backfire and threaten our own values as a nation. In many ways, it already has. We see this country ripped apart by mistrust in its institutions, a widening economic gap, social despair at every level, not to mention the fierce cultural and political divides we see today. If we were to only look at the right side of the dial right now, there have been two popular movements in conservatism over the last 10 years. The rise of the Tea Party and Trumpism. Both were powered by an anti-war, non-interventionist sentiment. Donald Trump won in 2016 in part by accusing the Republican Party of pushing us into a failed war in Iraq, and that the elites had further let us down by keeping us in endless wars abroad. Say what you want about his follow-through and about Trump himself, but denying that Trump was harnessing real energy, it's undeniable. I am under no illusion that the future of conservative foreign policy is the restraint one that I aspire to hear and not what Kori had been describing. But I do think it's a real competition right now for that mantle, and that the American people and American conservatism, American conservatives are much more questioning now after 9/11 than they were before. So thank you. I look forward to the debate that we are surely to have.
Thanks, Kelley. Kori.
So I think the gap between the views just expressed by my two colleagues showed just how much these issues are in play for conservatives. So my answer to your first question, Colin, is that it's a wild scrum right now among conservatives about what constitutes conservative foreign policy, both in its objectives and in its operation. I don't think we should be particularly alarmed by that, because that's so often been the case, right? Some of the largest tariffs levied in American history were led by William McKinley from the Congress before he was, and it got him elected president. If Dwight Eisenhower had not consented to take the Republican nomination in 1952, very likely Robert Taft's views would have created a very different kind of international order during and after the Cold War. So it's not unhealthy that conservatives are having this kind of bar fight, because that's how we both affirm the principles of conservatism and also how we test them against contemporary challenges. My sense of what should be conservative foreign policy is grounded very much in Eisenhower foreign policy, namely a belief that the country has a right to both security and solvency, and that how we preserve our liberties and advance them in the world needs to be consistent with the demands of our domestic needs and with shaping the world in a positive way. That is, that I do think the architects of the American-dominated international order that they brought into being after World War II, you know, these weren't idealistic academics. They were the hard-bitten men who had fought Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany and wanted a wider margin of error than the international order before 1945 had given us. I actually think the test bed for many of the policies that Kelley advocates are the 1920s and 1930s, where the United States did not choose to actively shape the international order, did not use its power, military, cultural, institutional, and economic to shape the international order in positive ways. We instead waited until the storms that were gathering reached much larger dimensions. And so what I would say in favor of the liberal international order, the order that those Americans built in the aftermath of World War II, was that it was designed to do three things. First, protect the United States by building strategic depth, by committing to care about other people's problems so that problems didn't grow so big they could become a threat to the United States homeland and American citizens. And so another term for what Kelley describes as endless wars is the United States strengthening allies and potential allies to bear more of the burden of a common defense. And the second characteristic of the international order as built after World War II, this liberal international order, the second characteristic of it is that it shares that burden with others. It buys a strategic depth. No hegemon has ever had as much voluntary cooperation in policing and enforcing the rules as the United States has. I take Nadia's point that America's allies should do more. I have been looking my entire professional life for better allies than the Europeans. And as soon as I can find allies that share more of the burden, I will trade every single one of the Europeans in. But as yet, we don't have those allies. And so cajoling our friends into continuing to share more of the burden, this liberal order does it better than any other order has. And I think the challenge for those who don't like the order is, how do you get this much voluntary cooperation without it? And the third characteristic of the liberal international order is that it creates principles, norms, rules that are advantageous not just to the United States, but also to small and middle powers that otherwise would not have the ability to shape the rules of the order, right? There is no preferential order that Australia or the Netherlands or Kenya could create than the order the United States is creating. And so it's remarkably low cost to sustain for the United States compared to how prior hegemons have, what they have had to do to sustain the order. So that's both what I think conservative foreign policy is and what it should be, but it's always a close run thing among conservatives. Two other quick points. I think the fundamental things that make this policy conservative are that first, it protects the fundamental freedoms. It's second, it's consistent with who we are as a political culture. It tries to create in the world the truths we hold to be self-evident. And the third thing that makes it conservative is that it is cheap relative to the alternatives. You pay a much lower price in defense spending, in blood, and in effort to sustain an advantageous international order than it would take to fight your way back from a different order. And as Nadia said at the start, if we're not creating and enforcing rules advantageous to us, others will change those rules that in ways that are less advantageous to us.
Great, thank you, Kori. Okay, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions of my own and then go to audience questions. I'll ask all of the panelists in the same order, starting with Nadia. How should American conservatives think about the use specifically of foreign economic policy tools, including, for example, tariffs, foreign assistance, economic sanctions, and free trade agreements? Of course, President Trump brought a very different approach to the use of some of those instruments, and President Biden now brings his own approach. What can we learn from these examples, and how should we think about using those kinds of policy tools looking ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And I guess I get to keep going first here. That's fun. So I think there are three. I'm not an economist. I think there are three fundamental issues, though, that we're grappling with as conservatives. One is the question of, do we want to have and will we have a worker-oriented trade policy, right? This is fundamentally what a lot of the debates about manufacturing are, and this is an issue for the administration. It was for the Trump administration, and it predated Trump as well, although he made it a kind of a pillar of his trade policy. Do we have a worker-oriented trade policy? Key question. Second, what is the link, and it's related to that, between manufacturing and innovation? That's really important as well. There is a link between the two. For a long time, globalization and the trends toward globalization led us to separate the two. We thought we could innovate, continue to be innovative, and grow while manufacturing itself was done abroad. And we've seen now the lay of the land, and we've seen many prominent economists and people who actually know about this issue argue that there is actually a very important link between the two. And so the competitive advantage now that countries have for having manufacturing facilities in their countries that creates an ecosystem of investment and scientific knowledge actually drives innovation. And that's really important now, because the supply chain issues that we're talking about are not just about the ability to get products when we need them quickly, but it really also goes to fundamentals of keeping an innovative American economy. Third, the belief that we can somehow cajole China to run its economy differently, right? I don't think we can. I think the evidence for that is very little. And so as soon as we understand that, again, what I said early on, that this decoupling, this tension is driven by a very specific way that the Chinese see their development, the CCP sees their development of their economy for their interests. And I think that that's really important. And I think, a point, so ultimately, these are trade issues. A fourth issue, I would say, is the role of the government, to Kelley's point, the role of the government in all of this, in recognizing all of this. And that's also where you see real debate among conservatives. I don't like the phrase industrial policy, but I like putting it as, what is the kind of innovation infrastructure we need, and what role does government play in that to ensure American dominance going forward? And there is a role for government, although it's not as big as some might say, and it's certainly not as big as what the Biden package today is advancing. So I think those are 4 key areas that we need to think about, and we're debating. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Nadia, and you are being a good sport for going first. Thanks. Kelley.
Thanks. And I apologize earlier. I had mentioned Kori in my remarks and referring back to Nadia's remarks. So I'm sorry about that. I was trying to customize my notes.
Compliment.
I flubbed.
The Twitter world will be happy.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, Nadia. I mean, there is a conservative landscape that is very contentious. And what you described in terms of the promotion of an industrial policy for the United States and a backlash to globalism is at the heart of Trumpism right now. Those purveyors of that policy are often very anti-China and are right on the bandwagon in terms of promoting a more aggressive posture against China. They see China as the sole sort of villain, and this narrative that the loss of jobs, the left behind, the despair that Americans are feeling is because of the jobs in the supply chains that had been redirected to China. I take a different view. I do believe that there is plenty of room for that industrial policy, or at least moving towards a more independent trade policy in which we do try to bring jobs back home, and more worker-centric policy. But I don't agree with the aggressive posture against China. So even within that, the slice of conservatism that I described, the paleo-conservatism that I described, there is definitely some room for contention about what the foreign policy should mean. Just getting back to the question in terms of how conservatives view things like foreign assistance and economic sanctions, those things are very much of interest to me and the Quincy Institute, because we have been studying, in particular, our Middle East foreign policy. And I would like to raise a big red flag about continued military assistance to some of the countries that we consider partners, but have further embroiled us in conflict in the Middle East. The more we do give foreign military assistance, I'm specifically talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, in which we give billions of dollars of some of our most high-tech weapon systems year over year. We give $3.8 billion in military assistance to Israel every year, so they can maintain their qualitative military edge. What we are seeing is that these countries are relying on that military assistance and not forging their own security themselves. And they have become dependent on the United States. But at the same time, the United States is entangled in their regional conflicts. You see that with Saudi Arabia. We had given Saudi Arabia weapons, and they turned around and invaded, or at least began a campaign, a war against Yemen. They convinced the United States that we needed to be in that war in Yemen to create a hedge against Iran. And so we found that we got deeper and deeper in a conflict in which there was really no stated U.S. military interest except for this idea that Iran was, we were somehow keeping Iran's influence at bay by being there. So we end up giving them military assistance that's used to kill civilians and create a complete humanitarian disaster there. Same with UAE, which was involved and still involved in the war in Yemen. And so we see that, you know, our giving this assistance is a blank check for these countries to not only create conflict with their neighbors, but also use them to repress their own countries, their own people. So we're talking about despotic monarchies, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia. And so I think as a conservative, I would like to see us scale back that military assistance. I would like to see us start retrenching from the region. I know that's a provocative statement, but I feel like our continued presence there, while it might have been great decades ago when we were there to protect oil interests, is no longer of value, and it's really not making the United States any safer. And I'd like to talk about sanctions too, but I don't want to take too much time.
Thanks, Kelley. Kori.
So there are two economic issues that are frequently overlooked in the conversation about global trade policy. The first is that tariffs aren't paid by the country you put them on. They're paid by the consumers of exports of those countries. And so tariffs can be useful as a punitive tool to affect another country's trade policies. But we should be clear about the fact that it's consumers, and in our case, American consumers, who pay the cost of those tariffs. So conservatives have tended to use tariffs as a tool to shape market practices. And I think they're useful for that regard. But one of the things the Trump administration did that I think is very disadvantageous is to use national security grounds as a basis for putting tariffs on American allies, in particular Canada. That creates a sense that the United States is not a rule-bound power, and thereby drives up the cost of sustaining the existing rules of the order. The second point about trade that frequently gets overlooked is that the loss of American manufacturing jobs is not predominantly due to trade. Only about 15% of the American jobs lost in manufacturing in the last 25 years are the result of jobs moving to other countries. In fact, what has caused manufacturing job losses is exactly the innovation that Nadia was championing. It's that manufacturing has, in the United States, has increasingly become mechanized and become more efficient, so requires less human input. That is, it's not a trade problem, but it's a serious domestic policy problem for the United States, and something that we need to have economic policies that either help people transition or incentivize alternative means of employment to get the conveyor belt moving of people's manufacturing jobs going away and helping them find gainful employment in other ways. I'd be interested in Kelley's answer on sanctions, because I worry that we are dramatically overusing economic sanctions in a way that will sooner or later impinge on the primacy of the dollar as the global holding currency. And that is one of several really important structural advantages that, for example, make it possible for the United States to run the amazingly outsized federal debt that we run. Our debt would be unaffordable if we weren't the issuer of the global holding currency. And we ought to be a lot more careful about damage that we do or potentially do to the dollar's primacy. I think it's not surprising that the Chinese are trying to create a petro yuan to shift global payments for energy into their currency. And that in order to get around the sanctions, secondary sanctions the United States imposed on countries that are doing business in Iran, even our closest friends, the big three European allies, are trying to create a payments mechanism that skirts the dollar zone. Those are real threats to America's economic vibrancy, and we ought to be thinking a lot more carefully than we are about how to preserve that.
Kelley, did you want to pick up that point about sanctions?
Yeah, I think those are magnificent points. And I would like to take the humanitarian, perspective, because while I totally appreciate, Kori, what you were saying about the economic interests, the blowback that we would inevitably have to them, I find that sanctions in the study and the reporting that I have done, I have found that they don't necessarily work. And if anything, they hurt the very people that we are supposedly trying to help, the regular people. And so, for example, the Trump administration made a big deal about the maximum pressure campaign. It wanted to put on Iran, and did, in the wake of pulling out of the 2015 JCPOA, or the nuclear deal. We have not found that has actually worked in our favor. If anything, they have been able to skirt or find go-betweens or go-arounds, like Kori had described, to get their oil on the open market and find partners that they can work with, usually people that we consider enemies, like China. But it has created a political situation in Iran in which the hardliners have predominated the most recent, the current presidential elections, in which there are no moderates on the slate there. It's created a situation where it's emboldened the very hardliners that the Trump administration and previous Republican administrations felt that they could topple. They could enact some sort of regime change through enforcing these regulations that are sanctions that would crush Iran and its government and its regime so badly that the moderates would rise up and be able to prevail. And at the opposite has happened. It's actually emboldened the hardliners. We are right back at the bargaining table for the JCPOA right now, back to square one. So all of that maximum pressure, what did it do? Well, it kept regular Iranians from getting medication, from getting healthcare equipment, from getting a decent wage. I mean, all of it trickled down to the people. We remember what happened in Iraq during the sanctions before the big Iraq war under the Clinton administration. It killed children, it killed families, it killed Iraqi life. So we can go down the line of all the sanctions that have been imposed, but that didn't work. We've seen sanctions in Russia continuing, but yet Putin just does what he wants anyway. But yet economically, it doesn't help people. It doesn't help democratic movements. And that's what I think we've been sold, that bill of goods, that somehow sanctions are war light. But I see sanctions are just warfare and under another name. And I don't believe, I agree with Kori, I think it diminishes our values. I think it diminishes possibly the value of the dollar. And they are indeed being overused as a tool of warfare and of, U.S. American influence in the world, or imposing that influence.
Could I make a comment, Colin?
Yes.
So there is one area where I think I I differ with both of you on this. One, I don't think sanctions doesn't diminish dollar dominance. Sanctions are an incentive for countries to do other things that will diminish dollar dominance. So China's adoption of a digital currency, other efforts to reduce the dollar's dominance, which I believe they're doing, are just sanctions further incentivize that. So down the line, they just provide an incentive for countries to find ways to get around the sanctions. And one way is to reduce the dominance of the dollar. But second, to Kelley's point, the fundamental disagreement I have with the viewpoint that you advance is that it's only the United States that has agency in the world. And this really puzzles me. And I think I can say this actually more broadly about the American conservative, although I do have actually other friends writing for it, and I disagree with them and debate this all the time. It's never about the agency, the discussions happening in other countries. It's always the United States causing everything, causing ISIS, radical jihadism. Our very presence is the center point for sort of all the problems in the world. It is the government of Iran that's taking choices to prevent feeding its people. It is the government of North Korea that is starving its own people. Other countries have agency. They have political elites. They have individuals in power. And those individuals, they're taking those decisions. The United States is not the master puppeteer. So I honestly don't understand arguments which really are not discussing the will, the goals, the objectives of other countries. It's not all is it a happy hand-holding world where if we just stayed home, would everyone want the same thing? Because I see a world of a lot of diversity, a lot of different views in how you order your political system and how women are treated around the world and how economic systems are ordered. I'm not saying that the US has to be involved in that. That's a different discussion. I'm merely talking about actually a fundamental difference in analysis in how you see the world. And so that's what kind of puzzles me. I think there are different political and economic systems out there, and some of them are not aligned with US interests and goals. That's a different issue from what we should do about it. So that's, I feel like, to accuse the United States of willfully killing people around the world, where are all of the political leaders and governments in those countries? That's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Nadia. Kori, did you want to add a thought to that? No? Okay. All right. I have a question I'd like to ask from one of the audience members, specifically for Kelley. It's that, Kelley, you've expressed affection for Code Pink. How does that fit into a conservative foreign policy vision?
Well, I don't know how I expressed an affection for it. That's an interesting way of putting it. I remember being sort of a compatriot of other anti-war people and movements during the run up to the Iraq War, during the Iraq War, at the sort of the birth of the drone wars, and Code Pink was always there. And I came from a conservative tradition over the last 20 years working at the American Conservative, where we did reach across the aisle and joined up with other non-interventionists, no matter what political stripe they were. And so I don't know in what context that I expressed affection for. It might be that I probably called Medea Benjamin a badass because she stood up at a recent it was a shareholders meeting of one of the top 5 defense contractors. She got in by buying a share and went up there and asked them about their responsibility to protect civilians when they were building bombs that were being used in Yemen and being found on the ground in these craters in Yemen. And I called her a badass. So maybe that's what your questioner is referring to. But I find that crossing the aisle is one way of getting things done. It should be done more in this city. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. But during those first years of the war, after 9/11, there was a lot of, bridge building going on between the left and right. The conservatives that I had described the Pat Buchanan American conservatives, the libertarians, the constitutional conservatives who are really despairing over the direction of the country and war, found some kindred, spirits in those people on the left. So I have no, regrets about that.
Okay, thanks, Kelley. Next question. This is for the whole group. As conservatives, do we spend too much on national defense or too little? Nadia.
Oh my God, you're really
No, Nadia, it's an advantage that you get to set the terms of the debate for us all.
Okay. We spend too little. We spend less than, we went from, I looked up some figures during the 1960s, national defense, 8 to 9%, 70s went from about 8% to under 5%. We're at just under 4% now. So we spend too little. I agree with Kori's point that ultimately, the best defense against war is essentially the capabilities, having the capabilities to deter. That doesn't mean that we're spending on the right things, right? There's a whole debate about that. So I don't think we're spending on the right things. I think we need to relook at legacy platforms, all of the arguments now being made, by really smart people across the spectrum. Chris Brose's book is great. These are debates that AEI is having. But ultimately, no, we're based on, we're sort of still in that post-Cold War period when it was the unipolar moment, and the bottom-up review is still dictating the way our force structure is and the way our defense spending is. And right now, we do face a world with all different kinds of challenges and threats, and not all of them require, the same type of military force. But bottom line is, I think we could spend more and should spend more.
Thank you. Kelley?
Well, I find, like, especially among conservatives, this is a real tough conversation to have, because I think ultimately conservatives who are in my, end of the field often start debating the top line, whether or not the budget, whether it comes in. I think the Biden budget came in at something like $740 billion on Friday. And then there's a flurry of stories about whether it should have been 5% more, or on the left, they're saying it should have been dramatically lower. But I think that the best way to talk about this is probably whether or not our strategy, fits the budget, or the budget fits the strategy. And somebody, and I forgot who it was, had said to me that unfortunately our strategy is dictated by budgets and budget making in Washington, rather than having a sound strategy dictating what the budget should be. And I feel like, I agree with Nadia. I believe this is a conversation for so many reasons we're not having at the granular level. I feel like, we have strategy, we have a lot of strategy papers and a lot of reports and a lot of platitudes, and we get speeches on the Hill about the great power threats by by Russia and China. But they're not really strategy. I think if we had a tough, open conversation, devoid of all the special interests in the defense community and the political interest on the Hill, on what our strategy of deterrence should be in regards to China, Russia, that would be a first step. But, as a reporter in this town for so long, I've seen how the intense lobbying on the Hill by a myriad special interests, whether it be the top 5 defense contractors or all of the other people who are lining up, at the trough for their piece, they end up getting the big ear, and that ends up in the budget. But we never get a sense of whether or not it works, if it's a good fit for our strategies or our positioning in the world, and better yet, if we could get it cheaper, less expensive, more effective, more efficient. We are building, and I wrote down a few things about the recent budget coming out, but they're asking for $2.6 billion for a ground-based strategic deterrent, which is the follow-on to the Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missile, billions more for a B-21 bomber, $5 billion more for new nuclear missile submarine, and more for more cruise missiles, and the modernization project. These are all things that the Biden administration are on the campaign and said, we're gonna take a look. There was a real tough talk about, not falling into the same nuclear posture in terms of expending the trillions of dollars on modernization. And it seems like the special interests always prevail. I could go on because this is a real hobby horse of mine, that I feel like once as a reporter you get into Washington, you see how the sausage is made, and you realize that we could be doing more for less half the time, that there is this entire ecosystem of the military industrial complex where is making these defense contractors, which these top 5 guys, they have a monopoly on a lot in this town, and they have the military over a barrel, in which they are responsible for much of what we see out there, our big planes, our missile systems, our ships. And with Cost Plus and with all of the add-ons and some of these things, like you see the F-35, you start to wonder, is a taxpayer really getting the bang for its buck? I mean, I have a great story here that I must have missed. But the Navy's first 4 littoral combat ships, the LCS, will be headed into mothballs this year, according to a report last year. Now, these ships were just commissioned like 6 to 10 years ago, but they're already outdated. But each of them costs $350 billion or more. And we're already decommissioning them and going on to the next shiny object. And so my point is, I know I said a lot here. My point is that we have never had a serious discussion about strategy and budget, but also about how we are spending our money. And I know the argument usually goes to whether or not we should spend more or less, but I think how has been missed here.
Thank you. Kori.
So I agree with Kelley that American defense spending isn't efficient. But her description of why it's not efficient would require the end of actual politics in America, right? That special interest groups are also known as Americans trying to affect policies. And so to argue we should have a strategy unhindered by the politics of preferences by businesses, by civil society groups, by individuals like Kelley herself, is to argue for a worse strategy, not a better one. And I disagree fundamentally with her that we never have a serious debate about strategy. I actually think we're having a pretty good debate about strategy right this minute. The reason that democracies tend to make fewer catastrophic mistakes than authoritarian societies is because we have the free exchange of views. And that's actually more true in the United States than in other free societies because of the diversity of the country and a political system that sweeps thousands of people in and out of government with every changed administration. So you have governments in waiting that remain educated on policy and incentivized to provide alternatives. To the strategy, to whether we are spending enough on defense. The strategy that Nadia so ably crafted in 2017 was translated into defense policy with the expectation that defense spending would increase by 3 to 5% every year in perpetuity. Now, one question is why American governments permit the Defense Department to enact strategies that require more money than they have. But that's a conversation for another time. The implementation of the national security strategy that Nadia crafted, and that based on their interim guidance, the Biden administration is actually not very much changing. you got that increase in spending in the first year and a half of the Trump administration and not subsequently. So we are already creating a dangerous underfunding of the existing strategy. And what dangerous underfunding translates into historically are challenges by adversaries and wars you lose. So no, we're not spending enough to carry out the strategy we currently have, nor are we spending enough to carry out the strategy that it sounds like the fine-tuning the Biden administration wants to do, which is spending more on diplomatic and cultural and economic aspects and tools so that you can reduce the reliance on the use of military force in American strategy. So what it sounds like the Biden administration wants to do requires more money, not less money, for rebalancing American strategy.
Thanks, Kori. Okay, so we've just got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask one question for the whole group and just ask you to answer it in 1 minute each if you can, and then we'll conclude. And the question is, what do you consider the single greatest threat to United States national security in the Biden era, and why? Starting, as always, with Nadia.
Okay, of course. So I'm going to take the single greatest threat is that there is not a single biggest problem, right? We keep pretending as a country that we can't multitask. The fact is, we have to. There are lots of challenges out there and lots of opportunities. There are regions of the world in which we need to help preserve a balance of power. There are key functional areas from space to different technologies, AI, other domains that are really critical to long-term American security. We need to worry about that. They're the domestic foundations of this country as well. But the fact is, our government, we spend trillions of dollars a year, trillions. There are millions of employees of our government, millions. That should give us enough leeway to actually focus on many of these different problems. So again, so it's not just one single threat. And I think it reduces things and simplifies things in a dangerous way to say that. So I'll just leave it at that. And you probably know, the specific threats geopolitically. Yes, I think the CCP poses a serious long-term threat to the United States. And I think a lot of obviously the domestic polarization and what we're seeing internally is weakening the country as well. Nothing new there. Thanks.
Thanks, Nadia. Kelley.
Sure. I just want to, I'm going to preface my statement. I just wanted to respond to Kori quickly about representation, because I feel like in a perfect world, yes, we all have an agency, and we all have the ability to petition our government, to petition our government in a sense of having a voice, whether it be on Capitol Hill or with our federal government. I respectfully disagree. What I was talking about is the lobbying by big for-profit companies, defense contractors, who do have a bigger megaphone, who have armies of lobbyists on the Hill. I don't have an army of lobbyists. The non-interventionist conservatives do not have lobbyists on the Hill, nor do we have people working in the Pentagon at every single level. You have a revolving door where you have people who have been working within the industry, going to work for government and working in procurement and acquisitions, then going back. We have a Secretary of Defense who came from Raytheon. Raytheon is one of the top 5 defense contractors and makes billions of dollars off the government every year. So they have a stake in seeing somebody like Lloyd Austin in the Secretary of Defense's office. And that goes for other members like the Secretary of the Air Force, who is up for nomination right now. So I just respectfully disagree. I feel like the representation is skewed for these companies, for these interests who do make money off of war. And they make money off of us having a strategy in place that requires bigger budgets so that they can go back to their shareholders and say, look what we've done for you. Just like the we had a
Kelley,
story
I'm
up at
sorry, but
Responsible Statecraft about this.
Kori
Yeah.
a chance to finish. We have about 1 minute left.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see the time, but I would say that is the biggest threat to national security right now.
Thank you.
And I think the biggest threat to America's national security is a rising China that wants to subvert an international order that has made China prosperous, as well as advantaging the United States and a whole host of other countries.
Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for a stimulating conversation. And we'll have more panels in this series on the future of conservative foreign policy. I'd like to thank our panelists and our audience, and keep in touch.
Thank you. I'm not going first next time, but I will join. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.